Hello everyone, my name is Taban Eslami and today I'm going to present our paper titled as Similarity-Based Classification of ADHD using Singular Value Decomposition. The other author of this paper besides me is Dr. Fahad Saeed from Western Michigan University. First of all, I want to apologize that we're not able to attend to the conference, and I want to say thank you to the organizers and the chairs of the conference and this session for giving us the opportunity to present our paper remotely. This is the outline of our paper. First, I'm going to give you a brief introduction of the problem, then I will talk about background information and the data that we used for this problem. We will see our proposed method, experiments, and results, and finally, I will talk about conclusion and future works of this study. So as introduction, let's talk about the classification problem that is used for classifying healthy versus neurological patients. Actually, the goal is discovering patterns in the data and using them for prediction on new data. There are many problems that are investigated using machine learning algorithms, many brain disorders, for example, mild cognitive impairments, Alzheimer's, ADHD, etc. And the data that we used for this classification problem is usually brain images, which can be fMRI, for example, or MRI images, along with demographic information of the patients and healthy subjects, for example, their age, their IQ, and other information like this. And we use all of these information in order to train classifiers and use them for predicting the label of test set. For this study, we specifically focus on ADHD disorder. This is a prevalent disorder among children, and about 7% of children in the United States are suffering from this disorder. It causes many problems like aggression, excitability, hyperactivity, and many other problems in children. It usually continues to adulthood. And the issue about this disorder is that its cause is unknown, and we don't know what causes this disorder. And usually the feedbacks from teachers and parents are used for detecting this disorder. In ADHD classification, we're dealing with two groups of children. The first group contains healthy children, and the second group contains children that are suffering from ADHD. So ADHD itself is divided into three subtypes, which are combined, inattentive, and hyperactive. And the goal of ADHD classification is assign one of these four labels to a test child. So we can consider this problem as a multi-class classification since we have four classes in our problem. Based on the importance of this problem, a competition was held in year 2011 called ADHD-200 Competition, in which the data was provided from a couple of brain imaging centers around the world, and researchers were invited to come up with machine learning algorithms in order to perform ADHD classification. And after the competition was ended, the results was surprising because the prediction accuracy was not really high. The results that was released by the competition showed that the average accuracy of all participants for this competition, as is shown in the second column in this table, is really low. Like the highest accuracy is about 65%, which tells us there's still some room for improving this problem. So the data that we used for our paper is fMRI data that is provided using competition, and fMRI is short for functional magnetic resonance imaging. It's a brain imaging technique for studying brain's functional activities. In this technology, several images are taken from different levels of the brain from bottom to top, and by putting all of these images on top of each other, we are able to recreate the whole brain volume. We have a couple of these images over time, and we can recreate the whole brain volume over time, which helps us to keep track of activity of brain regions. So the smallest addressable element in fMRI data is a small cubic elements called voxels. Voxels have the same concept as pixels in two-dimensional images, but since fMRI images are three-dimensional, we work with voxels. Each voxel contains millions of neurons, and based on the activity of neuron, the contrast or intensity of voxel changes over time. If we keep track of this activity or this intensity over time, we're able to extract a time series or signal out of each voxel, which we use these signals in our study. So basically, these signals are the data that we use for our algorithm. Usually, researchers prefer to work with regions in the brain instead of small voxels because working with a large number of small voxels adds noise and it's also really time consuming. So the competition also provided the data in terms of regions of interest. They applied a clustering algorithm on the voxels and they put all the voxels which are functionally very similar to each other in the same groups or the same regions, and then they took the average of time series of all voxels in the same region as the time series of that region. So instead of working with thousands of voxels, now we have 119 regions, and for each region we have a time series, and this is the data that we use for our method. So the idea of our proposed method is to compute the similarity between brains based on internal patterns of fMRI data, and then we apply k-nearest neighbor classification for prediction step. So we use a method called J-Eros in order to compute the similarity between two brains. This method was proposed by Wang and Shahabi in 2004, and this is a measure for similarity between two multivariate time series. Basically, in multivariate time series, we're dealing with items having more than one time series. For example, in CyberGovs, we have a bunch of sensors, each of them generate a time series, and fMRI data is another example of multivariate time series in which we have a bunch of regions, and for each region we have a time series. We can store the multivariate time series in an n by m matrix, which n is the number of variables and m is the length of time series or the number of time points in the time series. So the way that J-Eros computes the similarity between two multivariate time series A and B is that it first computes the covariance matrix of A and B, it applies singular value decomposition to the covariance matrices and takes the right eigenvectors and eigenvalues, and since singular value decomposition is applied to covariance matrix, bright eigenvectors are principal components of the data, and it also computes a weight vector based on eigenvalues of all multivariate time series items in training set. Based on eigenvectors and this weight vector that is generated based on eigenvalues, J-Eros computes the similarity between two multivariate time series. So formally, J-Eros computes the similarity between A and B based on this equation. In this equation, W is the weight vector. AI and BI are the ith eigenvector of A and B, and basically J-Eros computes the absolute value of the cosine of the angles between corresponding eigenvectors of two multivariate time series. It computes a weighted sum of all of these cosine values, and this weighted sum is actually the similarity between two multivariate time series. In this figure, we can see like corresponding eigenvectors and angle between them. So the way that J-Eros computes this weight vector is based on considering all eigenvalues over all multivariate time series items. So when we have n variables, we will have n eigenvalues for each sample. First of all of these eigenvalues for each item is normalized in the first three lines, and next an aggregate function is applied to all of ith eigenvalues over all items in a dataset. For example, we take the average of all of the first eigenvalues over all items, then we take the average of the second eigenvalues and so on. So we generate n values, and finally we normalize all of these values and we will have our weight vector, and this is the weight vector that is used for computing the similarity between two multivariate time series. Now we know how we want to compute the similarity between two brain. The next step is the classification, and we chose k-nearest neighbor as our classification technique. Now the question is that what is the optimum value of k, because in KNN we usually don't know to choose which k, and we have to find this k using some model selections. So we performed fourfold cross validation for picking the best value of k, and in order to assess the value of k, we tried not using accuracy as a measure for assessing k. And the reason is that in usually classifying brain disorders from healthy subjects, the data sets are imbalanced, which means that we have more healthy subjects rather than patients. And if we consider accuracy as our assessing measure, probably our classifier tends to predict everyone as healthy and gives us a good accuracy, but sensitivity in this case is really low and sometimes it's equal to 0. So this is not a good measure for assessing for our model selection, or in our case that we want to assess each value of k for KNN. This is not a good measure. So we used another measure called J statistics, which is sensitivity plus specificity minus 1. And since J statistics considers both sensitivity and specificity, we hypothesized that probably we can get a better result rather than considering only accuracy. So we called our proposed method J-Eros, which is the combination of using Eros as similarity measure, performing fourfold cross-validation, while considering J statistics as our assessing measure. So in J-Eros, the first step is taking the time series of each region, storing them in a matrix, compute the covariance matrix of each time series matrix, and compute the eigenvalues and eigenvectors. We do this process for all training and testing items. Then we pick the training items and we perform the fourfold cross validation. In fourfold cross validation, we have a bunch of test subsamples and training subsamples. For each test subsample, we compute the similarity of that subsample with all training subsamples, and based on KNN, we predict the label. We do this for all items in test subsample, and we compute the average J statistics. We do this process for all folds, and then we select the value of k with highest J statistics, and we go to the next step, which is classification of test set. So based on training set, we pick the best value of k, and we compute the weight vector based on training set and use them for classifying our test set. Experiments and results. So we used 3 data sets that were provided by competition, and these 2 tables show the membership information of training and test data for these 3 data sets. And as I said earlier, we are dealing with 4 different classes: control, which is a healthy, and we have 3 subtypes for ADHD. So in the first experiment, we compared the accuracy of J-Eros, which is our proposed method, with 2 other baselines. The first baseline is the result that is released by ADHD Competition, and the second one is a method proposed by Colby et al. In which they used fMRI, MRI, and demographic information. And they also used Eslami as one of their methods for classification. And as you can see, for 2 data sets, KKI and NYU, we got better results than 2 other approaches. For 1 data set, we got comparable results with ADHD Competition, but our result is lower than Colby's technique. We also compared the sensitivity and specificity of our approach. We could also we just compared it with Kolbe's technique because we didn't have the result of the competition, so we couldn't compare our result with them. And for all of these three data sets, we got more than 50% sensitivity, and we got like comparable and good specificity for all of these three data sets. And in comparison, Kolbe's technique, they got 0% sensitivity for KKI and OSU. And actually, this comparison shows that our method is working really good in terms of sensitivity. We also performed another experiment to evaluate the effect of J statistics. So instead of J statistics, we performed everything with while considering specificity and sensitivity instead of J statistics. And the results shows that J statistic is a better approach rather than only sensitivity or specificity, as we get higher accuracies by considering J statistics. So we also measured the running time of our technique, and this slide also shows the time complexity of this method based on number of samples in training set, number of brain regions, and maximum length of time series over all subjects. So the overall time complexity of entire four-fold cross-validation is quadratic in terms of number of samples, and it's cubic in terms of number of regions. And also the running times are low for is about 5 minutes for two data sets, and it's about 20 minutes for another data sets. For NYU data set that it takes 20 minutes, the reason is that we have the number of subjects in these data sets are much more than the number of subjects in the other two data sets. And as we can see, based on time complexity, it's quadratic in terms of number of subjects, and this is the reason that it needs longer time. But the good thing about this technique is that we can easily parallelize the process, because computing the similarity of one test sample with all other training samples, they can be done in parallel, and they are independent from each other. So as conclusion, the problem that we try to solve is ADHD classification. The goal is classifying subjects as healthy or ADHD, and we have three subtypes for ADHD. And we used Eros as similarity measure and performed KNN as our classification technique. In order to pick the best value of K, we performed four-fold cross-validation, and we used J statistics for assessing each value of K, and the results are promising in terms of accuracy, sensitivity, and specificity. And here are a couple of references that we used for this study, and the remaining references of this work can be found in the original paper. Thank you so much for your time, and I will be very happy to answer your questions.